The Lions tour for 2025, folks, feels like it has taken a step closer. It feels a bit more real. We don't have any players named yet, but we have the coaches. Andy Farrell has named 5 assistant coaches who will head down to Australia with him. We'll go through them. What were their roles with their previous setups? How does this potentially look in terms of affecting the game plan or the selections for the Lions? We'll go through them and maybe some of the guys who are big name omissions, and you guys can let us know your thoughts on how you think Andy has gone. He's certainly gone with guys he knows, and he even mentioned that when interviewed after the kind of announcement. He said there's an element of what I know, because 3 of the coaches he has worked with in the Irish setup. There's no coaches from Wales. Yeah, none of the Welsh coaches have been selected, so that's, I feel like, probably indicative that there's not going to be many Welsh players going on the tour. Maybe Jack Morgan, but that's just gut feeling, and I feel like pretty reasonable given where Welsh rugby is at the moment. I'm not sure that there's many of the guys knocking on the door for Lions selection in 2025. From Scotland, though, they have got one coach. That's John DL. He's the forwards coach from Scotland, which maybe doesn't seem like the most obvious pick, because if you're thinking Scottish rugby, the one area of strength doesn't necessarily seem to be their forwards. You would probably say it's their kind of sexy back line that gets heaps of tries out wide and clean breaks and defenders beaten and whatnot. But if you think about the other guys who would have been potential candidates for the forwards role, I mean, Paul O'Connell is taking over the Irish team in the interim while the other coaches are away with the Lions, so he's pretty much unavailable. Steve Borthwick, I believe, looks after the forwards with England. He's England's head coach and is not going to do a Gregor Townsend from the last tour, so he's going to be going on England's mid-year tours as well. So they're not going to pick any Welsh coaches. I don't mean to say it disrespectfully, but it just seems like John DL, unless they wanted to go for a club selection, seems like the most obvious choice, and he's the one guy who is available. But yeah, I think it's good for Scotland to certainly have a voice in terms of having a coach amongst the 5 assistants. From England, they've got Richard Wigglesworth. He's been kind of attack coach with England, and he's been kicking and strategy coach with England as well. Again, he maybe doesn't seem like the most obvious choice, because if there's one thing you would say about England right now is sometimes their attack, maybe in the last 2 games it looked pretty flash in the Six Nations, but it's not an area that has looked all that fluid at times. But he is going to have to work, I guess, with Andrew Goodman, who's the Irish backs coach, who is also one of the coaches. So it's going to be, I guess, a mixture of responsibilities. Andy Farrell didn't really go into specifics as to who's going to be looking after what, but basically that with so many games back to back and so many players, that essentially it might be that different guys are looking after different groups at different times. For the Irish contingent, which is 3 of the 5 coaches, you've got Andrew Goodman. As I mentioned, he's the backs coach for Ireland. He's talked about wanting to play an attack that excites. I think his appointment is not that exciting to some Irish fans who would like to see the Irish backline clicking a bit more. But he is the Kiwi in amongst the group. John Fogarty is the Irish scrum coach. He, again, is a familiar one for Andy Farrell, having worked with him for a wee while. And, I mean, maybe Adam Jones was the kind of best chance for a Welsh coach to get on board, but he's only really just started working with the Welsh setup as well. And then Simon Easterby, having just finished the interim role over the Six Nations, is going to head back into the kind of assistance role. He's been the defence coach for Andy Farrell's Irish side, and he's been with Ireland for a long time. So, yeah, a very kind of familiar fit in that regard. Although, of these 5 guys, none of them have coached on a Lions tour before, which will be something different. Shaun Edwards is the other guy whose name gets talked about a lot, because he is such, in terms of an assistant coach who, assistant coaches often fly under the radar. We mainly focus about the head coaches, but he is one of those assistant coaches who genuinely has kind of big name presence because of his impact on the game. He's with France. So I don't think that they were ever likely going to strike a deal with France, especially with France coming down here to New Zealand. They probably want all coaches on board for that one. So yeah, he's not going to be too far away. 3.5 hours flight from Australia to New Zealand. But yeah, he'll have his hands full over on this side of the Tasman. They did mention that there's been approximately, in their first kind of 24 hours of meeting, 70 odd players who have been discussed. If you can call that a short list, they do have a short list, but they need to get down to, they haven't announced the exact number yet, but low 40s, high 30s in terms of a final group of players to travel. Like I mentioned, I think with such a strong Irish coaching contingent, I would be highly surprised if it is not a largely Irish squad that goes. I would be surprised if many of the Welsh guys go, but again, that's not exactly a Nostradamus pick right there. But I do think for England and for Scotland to have a coach on the panel will at least help, Andy Farrell get a decent idea of what these guys are like from a different perspective. Like Andy Farrell would have coached against a lot of these, players he's going to be potentially picking from, but to have the kind of inside knowledge from the likes of Wigglesworth and DL, he'll get a better feel of how they might fit in, because getting cohesion with the Lions is certainly always one of the kind of, toughest roadblocks in their way. But yeah, that's the Lions coaching staff. It is maybe a little bit surprising in some areas, as I mentioned, like an English attack coach and a Scottish forwards coach, but I do think Andy Farrell knows his stuff and will likely get the most out of these coaches that he can. You guys let us know your thoughts. How do you think they are going to go against Joe Schmidt, who knows a lot of these guys pretty well too? You guys take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. See you later.